What it is, people, my name is Batman, and as you know, today the official reveal is out for the new Call of Duty, and it's centering around PMCs. Now, a private military contractor is just a fancy term for mercenaries, and we're all familiar with that concept, I'm sure. Guns for hire, sell swords from Game of Thrones, etc. And I think it's really cool that so far, at least, it seems like Call of Duty is going to tackle real-world issues, specifically the morality of PMCs with their story arc. If the next COD is going to center around tackling the practical, economic, and philosophical implications of mercenaries in the 21st century, I thought we should go ahead and lay the groundwork and really look into the reality of the situation. So along with the reveal trailer, there was also a COD trailer put on by Vice where they included real-world interviews from PMC mercenaries and such, and the general theme that I think they were getting at was that as the military industry becomes more privatized, soldiers that answer to a paycheck as opposed to the chain of command topped off by a democratically elected head of state, should we the people be concerned? Should we be frightened of an army raised by a paycheck in a world where 1% of the population has a higher net worth than the bottom 99%? And we know that there's going to be a scene, obviously, on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, which suggests some sort of domestic conflict on a major scale, which I think is a bit overblown. I do not think there's rational cause for a concern of a major military operation conducted by a PMC against a first world government. Because the truth is, those of us in the first world countries do not have to be too concerned about our own safety. I'm not sure how the story's going to go in the new Call of Duty, but I do know that if a private military contractor was hired by a wealthy corporation or individual to rise against a first world government or to conduct military operations within the borders of a first world nation, it would be pretty easy for said government to put a stop to the whole thing with a push of a button, because the government can freeze your assets if they have proper cause, right? That's what we see going on with the whole Russian annexing Crimea thing right now. The US is freezing the assets of basically all the wealthiest Russian individuals that have any amount of money invested in bonds in the US. And, you know, many of the wealthiest folks around the world do invest in U.S. bonds just because it's the most stable currency, or they choose some other first world country, whether it's the UK or Germany. It doesn't really matter, because the first world countries of North America and Europe and Australia are all pretty much in lockstep when it comes to each other's interests as far as domestic policy goes, which generally means if you fuck with one of them, you fuck with all of them. So in theory, if a private military contractor tried to rise against a first world government, whoever was writing the paychecks would have their assets frozen and would thus be unable to pay the PMC, and then the PMC wouldn't have any reason to go on fighting. And keep in mind, you know, the majority of the guys working as private contractors are former members of the military. They fought for their country, they probably killed for their country, and most of them aren't going to be friendly to the idea of treason. However, that being said, I know about a year ago there was a story about a former Marine sniper who got caught working with the Drug Cartel, trying to assassinate DEA agents. The Drug Cartel should be labeled as a terrorist organization, I think. Right now they're just organized crime, so you can't go after them with the big guns, but they are just as evil as Al-Qaeda. I mean, I remember the story about how they left a couple hundred mutilated torsos, like out of Fallout 3, just torsos without any limbs or heads, and dumped them off in a highway to intimidate people. And if that's not an act of terror, I don't know what is. I say we drone the motherfuckers, but I digress. Even if the U.S. didn't freeze their assets, not even the wealthiest corporations in the world are going to be able to outbid a fucking government, because governments can basically spend unlimited amounts of money at this point. The way it works is people put their money in U.S. Treasury bonds. It's a basic investment. They're looking to make a profit. The government can spend that money now, and then they pay it back to you with interest later, and there's no real limit to how much they borrow. For instance, in the U.S., we have a big debt problem right now, because we borrowed a fuck ton of money to fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now there's a shit ton of interest that we have to pay off. But that, in and of itself, is a perfect example. The government did not have $1 trillion to spend on those wars, but they can still just do it because that's how powerful governments are. They just borrowed the money and fought 2 big-ass wars. So how are you going to outbid that? You can't. So first world governments aren't going to be the target. And I feel like that's what's been implied so far in the trailers. You know, you see that conflict on the Golden Gate Bridge. First world governments aren't going to be the target. They're going to be the aggressor with private military contractors, because from a government standpoint, there are a lot of advantages to using a private contractor as opposed to a government-owned unit. For instance, if a bunch of people get killed running a mission for a PMC, nobody has to know about it. Whereas if the unit is government-owned, as opposed to just government paid, and they run a mission and it fails miserably, lots of people are going to know about it. The president has to call the family members of the dead. There will be congressional investigations into what went wrong. Politicians may get thrown out of office. It's a national embarrassment. And I'm sure the government already has and will continue to use PMCs against third world countries to topple governments or pursue whatever interests they have there, probably oil. Now, what the Call of Duty reveal might have been implying is that a corporation uses a PMC to fuck with third world countries. You know, you kind of get that impression when Kevin Spacey's talking about how can we civilize this third world country when they don't respect a reporter's right to report on the president, whatever. And it is entirely possible that a corporation could use a PMC to fuck with a third world country, and it's probably inappropriate in a lot of ways, and they would have to keep it under the table. I mean, if word got out about such a thing, there would be international outrage, and governments would have their hand forced unless they already sanctioned it, but again, that would have to be under the table. Like, the public couldn't know about that because there would be outrage, I'm sure of it, but I don't think corporations are going to use PMCs to control third world nations, because the thing is, corporations can generally just buy a third world country. You know, they don't need to use guns. You put enough zeros at the end of the paycheck, governments sell out pretty quick. But what would be very interesting is when two major corporations basically go to war with one another. I mean, it would be the equivalent of a gang war. Right, instead of Bloods versus Crips, it's BP versus Halliburton. I mean, say two major oil corporations want to own the same third world country. Is it possible they could each hire their own PMC to fight one another, and then you have two PMCs fighting a proxy war against one another on behalf of major corporations? And if they are acting under the table and keep it off government radar, could they fight that proxy war like in the United States or in any other first world domestic territory? What happens when the CEO of Burger King gets assassinated by a PMC hired by Ronald fucking McDonald? We have plenty of gang wars and power structures that act outside of the government as it is in our own territory. You know, if you go to Oakland or Detroit, there are huge swaths of gang territory that the government has no presence in or control over. In Detroit, the cops don't come until the shooting has stopped, and they just come to retrieve the bodies. They don't come to arrest anybody. They get those bodies and they get the fuck out. It's the wild, wild west. And I can see something similar happening between big banks. I mean, it was just last year we caught HBSC laundering money for the Drug Cartel. You know, what if banks start assassinating government regulators that try to rein them in? Or imagine this, what if a bank hired a PMC to start destroying a competing bank's capital? Like, one bank owns a couple thousand houses and it's leveraging that for a trade, and suddenly all those houses start getting burnt the fuck down. So that corporation then has to hire their own PMC to guard their fucking physical capital, but so you have, two banks hiring their own PMCs to fight one another to try and destroy each other's capital. Suddenly it's just like open warfare on the streets. I don't know. To sum it up, PMCs aren't necessarily something we need to be afraid of, but they do pose a risk to the integrity of our society in regards to law and order, and I think there's also a lot of moral hazards that the international community as a whole needs to look at. But I'm sure Call of Duty will overblow it dramatically, and it will be a very hyperbolic campaign where PMZ takes over the Golden Gate Bridge and it's like, fuck y'all, we ride or die, pay us some money or we gonna vandalize this sumbitch. Please rate the video. This is Batman signing out.